Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Old Bones, Postmasters, Post-Oxford University. Let's hope my loss of access to the Bodleian Library doesn't damage this show too much. And so today we're beginning a two-parter, one of the more important parts of the series. So far we've been talking about the early Anglo-Saxon period, the period immediately post-Roman, but while England and most of the rest of the island of Britain was lacking any major political powers. Any political control was highly localised and more concerned with the rest of the world than what was happening across the rest of the island. Well, that's true in a highly simplified kind of way, but that's changing now. The rest of the world is starting to begin to pay attention to Britain and the weird things that have been happening since the Romans left, the Celtic monks, the pagan Saxons. And what's going to happen is that soon Christianity is going to return. Next episode, actually. And that's going to have a dramatic impact. But the reason it's going to have such an impact is it's going to accelerate changes that were already occurring on the island, namely the slow but steady emergence of larger political entities for whom a unifying religion with a single person in charge was very, very attractive. Quite brilliantly, we can speak about both of these dynamics by exploring one site. It's called Yeavering, and it's chock-block full of bodies all buried in quite dramatic fashion, but we'll come to that soon enough. Today we're going to understand how Yeavering developed and ask what that can help us infer for how kingdoms began to arise in England in the late 500s and early 600s. This will lead directly into how and why England converted. The two things are very closely connected. So strap yourselves in for Yeavering Part 1. I'm Andy Earnshaw, and welcome to Old Bones. Walk with me through the hills of Northumbria. We're not far here from the Scottish border, and that river you can hear, that's the River Glen. We're in the Cheviot Hills, the siblings of the Appalachians, ancient hills worn down to gentle nubs by millions of years of wind and rain. Wind and rain, incidentally, are not going to be as a regular companion on this walk as you might expect. England's northeast is quite a dry place. Oh, it gets its fair share of squalls off of the North Sea, but the weather that arises over that small, shallow sea is nothing compared to the degraded hurricanes that roll across the Atlantic. Those storms usually exhaust most of themselves on the western side of Britain, and here, on the northeast side of those ancient hills, you're mostly protected from the worst of the weather. When the wind does blow, though, you best be careful. It does get very cold this far north, and the wind has a nasty habit of blasting that cold air into your ears until your head feels a little funny. Every time I've climbed the hills, I benefit from one of those hats with flaps on the side, or a hood. These hills might have been worn back by millennia of erosion, but they're still steep. Once during my undergrad, one of the girls had to be carried up a hill like this, as it was too steep for her to climb. The hill we're climbing today is a particularly steep one called Yeavering Bell. It's got two peaks and rises dramatically from the River Glen's valley. Glen means valley, so one gets the impression that the River Glen is a misnomer like River Avon. Avon means river in Brittonic, and the reason there are many River Avons in Britain is that the Saxons and Romans asked the native inhabitants what the river was called and was given the name for river, Avon, rather than any specific name. Meaning England's western reaches are plagued with many waterways called river. The same dynamic occurs with the River Glen. One gets the impression someone asked a local where they were and they were told, somewhat confusedly, that they were in a river valley, a glen, and the person doing the asking assumed that they meant they were by the River Glen, literally river valley. This far away from the southeast, the locals don't speak the same as the southerners who claim to rule the country. That's how things are today, and it's how they've been for a long, long time. But keep going, even if your legs are getting tired. There's something very cool near the top of this hill. Cast your mind back to the last series when we spoke about Britain's prehistory. because there's a couple of friends atop Yeavering Bell. There are several pits, which may be the remains of a stone circle and a hill fort. But not just any hill fort, mind, one of the largest in the country. It sits right atop Yeavering Bell, the twin peak top of the site. It's well made, protected by walls of dry stone and a climb of over 300 metres to reach the centre of the fort. It's actually on the list for me and Mrs. Bones to visit. It seems like a good glute workout. But now we're up here, we can properly survey the landscape overlooked by this hill fort. The hill fort looks over a slope which drops precipitously to a large terrace called the Whaleback. And it's the Whaleback which we are concerned with today. In one of those fields, a man called Brian Hope Taylor oversaw some fascinating excavations in the 1970s. Catch your breath. That's where we're headed next. Down the hill we trudge. Go slow because your calves will begin to burn, but trust me, it's not very far. I want to walk you through what Brian Hope Taylor discovered because Yeavering has been famous for a very long time. The Venerable Bede, one of Northumbria's greatest minds, knew a lot about Yeavering. He called it Yeavering, and he wrote extensively about it because here, up in these chilly hills, Northumbria's conversion to Christianity took place. We'll talk more fully about that another time, but for now, here's what Bede said, quote, "So great is said to have been the fervour of the faith of the Northumbrians and their longing for the washing of salvation, that once when Bishop Paulinus came to the King and Queen in the royal palace at Yeavering, he spent 36 days there occupied in the task of catechising and baptising. During these days, from morning till evening, he did nothing else but instruct crowds who flocked to him from every village and district in the teaching of Christ. When they had received instruction, he washed them in the waters of regeneration in the River Glen, which was close at hand. This palace was left deserted in the time of the kings who followed, and another was built instead." End quote. So now we're on the Whaleback, now we're at Yeavering as the Anglo-Saxons imagined it. Let me tell you what was found. Let's get it out there. Yeavering is known as a palace complex, and complex is the right word for it. In Yeavering's history, a lot happened. There are at least 5 distinct phases we could speak about. So instead of going through those one by one and making this an overly descriptive episode, let me instead tell you about some of the main features, the main buildings and finds we're going to speak about. In fact, let's begin with building D2 because D2 is strange. Not really because of how it looks. It's a hall, rectangular, made of posts like a lot of early Anglo-Saxon buildings. But there are no finds, nothing in there. Also, there was a previous building, unexpectedly called D1, and it was built so shoddily that it fell only a few years after its construction. Building D2 was at first not built much better, but then it was rebuilt on a massive scale. It was also surrounded by a fence separated from the rest of the site, which we'll discuss in a bit. This D range of buildings are some of the earliest buildings on the site, and they're quite distinct, as I mentioned, from the rest of the site. First of all, there is that shoddy workmanship to begin with, as though the builders weren't very experienced. Secondly, not only are these D-shaped buildings separated quite physically from the rest of the site, but they're all aligned to north-south, directly perpendicular from all of the buildings that were built later on an east-west axis. Finally, they're strange because of what was found within them. D2 especially. And that's nothing. Okay, there is one building, D3. It's a sunken floor building and has some evidence of cooking. But D2 is this vast, giant hall with no evidence of burning, no evidence of pottery, no metalwork, no burials, nothing. And here we come to the wonderful archaeological word, ritual. This is a podcast that, as you all know, deals primarily with the dead. We use human burials to begin exploring the world, so religion is never far off from this show. But look, the word ritual gets a bad rap because it gets used to describe sites like these, sites where there's really nothing to talk about. And I think for those who are not archaeologists, when you find a clean building and declare it a ritual site, it feels like a bit of a stretch. But here's the thing, humans are messy, really, really messy. And so to find a site that has been kept clean even until it was destroyed means it was set aside for something that was out of the ordinary, out of the usual. And that, in human societies, tends to mean something with a religious bent. Hence why we can pretty confidently say that building D2, an otherwise large but unremarkable hall, was a ritual site. This is reinforced by the fact that almost as soon as these buildings were built, they were separated from the rest of the site, even before anything else had really been built. This separation is very common to sites of religious importance from a load of societies all across the world and all across ages. Oh, and there's a cemetery. Yeah, I should have mentioned the cemetery sooner. It dates back to the early 7th century, or as we prefer on this show, the early 600s. So quite late in this early Anglo-Saxon period, but my goodness, it is weird. The cemetery is centred on this ginormous post, and all the burials in this cemetery, and there are more than one, but all the ones that focus just on this cemetery are all surrounding and pointing towards this single point, creating this dramatic wheel effect whereby the feet of every grave point towards the post. And then all of these burials are then surrounded by a ring ditch. And I've not got a bit here that's scripted, so this is off the cuff, but I really want to make it clear, that's not normal. Usually Anglo-Saxon cemeteries develop quite organically, or they have what we call multifocal distributions, as in bits of burials are focused on other parts of the cemetery, so you have multiple points of focus. To have a cemetery that is so planned, so centralised, is really very strange for this period. In addition to this cemetery is a curious burial just outside the southwest corner of D2, far away from any other cemeteries. It's a crouched individual on their own with an ox tooth in the grave. And at first that might not sound all that interesting, but animal remains in burials are quite particular in Anglo-Saxon periods. They fall into certain categories. And having just a single ox tooth is again a strange, odd behaviour. It's not something you see very commonly. So what we have at D2 is a ginormous bare building with an associated cemetery. What we have here, as convincingly argued by many, including my friend Johan, is an extremely rare example of a pagan Anglo-Saxon temple. A proper set-aside religious site. As you know, we're going to come onto the nature of pagan beliefs next episode, but let me just say that sites like these are vanishingly rare, incredibly uncommon, and so to have one place set aside, probably specifically built for ritual activity, already marks this site out as incredibly important. Nor is this the only cemetery or individual burial on the site. They're all over the place. The cemeteries are never quite as distinct as the one literally outside building D2, so I won't go into it here, save for one find from grave AX. The fact that the name of the grave has an A in it means it comes from amongst the halls that we'll come to very soon, and these are the big halls that come to dominate the site, the sorts of places that were described in Beowulf. Outside the doors of one of these buildings, A4 if you want specifics, was a post hole. This post hole is interesting in itself, as at some point it was removed and replaced with a mixture of bones and teeth from either sheep or goat, and then probably powdered horn before being covered with a piece of sandstone. And this strange hole lay at the east end of a grave, where the head would have been. Around the head of this grave was a strange green discoloration in an arc, probably from a copper bowl placed above the head. Also in this grave was a skull that decomposed by the time Yeavering was excavated. But well, he and his team were excellent, and by looking at the outline left by the skull, they were pretty confident it belonged to a goat. So we have a goat skull, a strange copper bowl, and atop the skeleton lay a couple of rods. These were so strange that the excavator Brian Hope Taylor gave a whole chapter in his report to exploring what they were. And it appears they were some sort of ceremonial rod. They were wooden poles with a cross-section at the top, making them pretty useless as weapons. Its upper terminal, what on a spear we'd call the pointy end, well, this one wasn't pointed. Instead, I don't think Taylor describes it very well, and I can see why. I'm looking at the picture as I'm writing this and struggling to put it into words. It appears to be an arc of bronze wire around a wooden cone.